I'm Zoe Irons and I work for the charity Wellbeing of Women. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining. This is webinar 4 in a series of 5 webinars that we've been running. And if you haven't seen the others, then you can find all of those on our YouTube channel. Post this webinar, I will send out an email and the link to that will be on there. And then there'll be a 5th webinar, which I'll talk about at the end. But for now, I'm just going to pass over to Liz, who's going to tell you a little bit more.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Cunningham, and my business is Menopause Reality. We use immersive film to share women's own experiences of the menopause, the impact of the menopause on them. And Diane and I have been working together with Wellbeing of Women for the last couple of years to deliver live in-person sessions for employers to raise awareness and to educate people around the menopause. And we're really pleased to be also now delivering this webinar series. So as Zoe said, this is number 4 in the series of 5. You can go back and catch up on any of the previous ones on the Wellbeing of Women YouTube channel. And so please do that. I am going to today we've got 1 hour, and for the last 15 minutes we're going to be taking questions. So please do add any questions. Our topic today is about looking at improving workplace culture around supporting menopause. So please, any questions that you have, please do fill the chat. We will come to the questions in the last 15 minutes. And I'm going to pass over to my fellow panelists. So I'll start with Diane to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Danzebrink. As Liz said, we've been working together with Wellbeing of Women on this project for a couple of years now, but I run an organisation called Menopause Support and the National Make Menopause Matter campaign, and I'm also the author of a book called Making Menopause Matter.
Thank you, Diane. And now I'm going to pass. Our guest panelists today are Karen from Denton's and Charlotte from Amy, and I'll let them both introduce themselves. Karen and Charlotte, we've both delivered the VR-based workshops in your workplaces, but we've invited you both onto the panel today because you have got lots of information to share about other initiatives that you've done as well in your workplaces. So we're really pleased that you've joined us. Thank you very much. I'll start with you, Karen, if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Peart. I'm the operations manager at Denton's. I'm a qualified solicitor. I qualified about 30 years ago, and I've been working in the law for all of that 30 years in private practice, in-house and in education. I am the co-chair of Denton's steering group committee for the menopause, and I am a trained menopause mentor as well at Denton's. And I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you. And Charlotte?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Richman. I work for Amy, which is a data and tech focused consultancy here in Milton Keynes. I'm both personally and professionally passionate about menopause and making sure that women have access to what they need and, you know, creating opportunities for education and conversation around this topic in the workplace.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we're going to start today with just a little bit, a few introductory questions, just because in case people need some starting information about the menopause. I would say if we don't cover something here that is in the kind of the basics that you would like to understand about the menopause, please do go back to some of our earlier webinars, because we do go more deeply into that information. But Diane, I'm going to start by just asking you, why does the menopause matter, or why should it matter in the workplace?
Well, it should matter both in and out of the workplace, because the world population is currently just over 8 billion people, and half of them will experience menopause directly, and the other half will experience menopause indirectly because they will know or love somebody who is experiencing menopause. So it's vital that we all know about it. We know that we have more women over the age of 50 in the workplace than we've ever had historically. It's grown significantly in the last 30 years. It's one of the fastest growing demographics. And that is without counting all of those who might be in perimenopause, early menopause, or premature menopause. So it's really key that everyone has an understanding, because if we don't understand what's happening, so for those who are going to experience it personally, if they don't understand what's happening to them, they can't get the right help and support. But equally, if you're in a supporting role, whether that's personally or professionally, you can't support what you don't understand. And that has historically, that has been a really huge key issue in terms of people getting the right help and support. We know that a significant number of women either take a side step in their career during their menopause experience, or there are some who step away from the workplace altogether. And that's obviously a loss for the individual, but it's also a loss for the employer. So we really want to do everything that we can to ensure that those things are not happening in the future, by essentially plugging that information and education gap, because that really is the key to ensuring that things are better as we go forward.
And you mentioned that people need to have an understanding of menopause before they're able to support people in the workplace or outside of the workplace. So let's just make sure that everyone's on the same page. What is menopause?
So actually, menopause is quite diverse. The experience of menopause is quite diverse. So let's start with the experience of the majority, which is what you might hear perhaps doctors call a spontaneous or a natural menopause. And what they really mean by that is that for all females, as they get to a certain point in their life, for the vast majority, it's usually their late 30s, early 40s, their hormone levels begin to change. So with progesterone begins to fall over a period of years. With their estrogen starts to fluctuate, sometimes on a daily basis. And that is what can bring on menopause symptoms. Now, this period of the menopause transition is called the perimenopause. So, as I said, for many, perimenopause begins late 30s, early 40s. And the perimenopause to postmenopause transition, on average, lasts around anything between 4 and 8 years. That transition for some will involve no symptoms. So around 1 in 4 say that they have very few or no symptoms. Around 3 out of 4 say they do experience symptoms, and around 1 in 4 describes those symptoms as debilitating. For many, they will experience menopause. So this is the clinical diagnosis of the word, which means that somebody's had a continuous 12 months without a period. That will happen to them around 50, 51, 52, can be a little bit earlier, can be a little bit later. But everything after you've had 12 consecutive months without a period is called postmenopause. But there are also those who may experience menopause surgically. So that means that they have both of their ovaries removed at the same time. That puts them into an instant menopause. There may be those who experience a medically induced menopause. So that means that they're having some kind of medical treatment, which may have a permanent or a temporary effect on their ovarian function. And that can bring on menopause symptoms. Menopause between the ages of 40 and 45, so that total cessation of periods for 12 months or longer between the ages of 40 and 45 is described as an early menopause. But there are also those who might experience a premature menopause. So currently in the UK, premature menopause stats are 1 in 100 under 40, 1 in 1,000 under 30, and 1 in 10,000 under 20. Now, 1 in 10,000 under 20 is quite rare, but just think perhaps of the amount of people that you know or the size of the organisation that you work in, and 1 in 100 under 40 is really not that rare. So as you can see, we say menopause, but actually menopause, the experience itself, can be very diverse for each individual.
And we're going to go on in a second to start looking at, excuse me, different ways of supporting women in the workplace when they're going through this. But I think it would be useful to just get, if we can start by just having a quick overview of the types of symptoms that can affect people going through the menopause, because that is important to understand, to know how to support them.
Yeah, so symptoms really fall into 3 categories: physical, cognitive, and psychological. So I'm sure that many people will have heard about things like hot flushes, perhaps night sweats, and period stopping. However, there are many different physical symptoms, and some that people might not be aware of are things like heart palpitations, joint aches and pains. So if you do a manual job, joint aches and pains can be a real issue. Things like dry eyes, dry mouth, changes perhaps to your hair, thinning and drying. And then there's a sort of subset, if you like, of physical symptoms called the genitourinary symptoms. So they're things like increased urinary frequency or urgency, urinary tract infections, and vulval and vaginal symptoms. And they might not seem obvious in terms of affecting people at work, but of course they absolutely can. And if you don't understand why those things are happening to you, that's going to increase your levels of anxiety. So as a byproduct, that can have an effect too. And then cognitive symptoms, these are often symptoms that people say have a real effect on them in the workplace. And these are things like changes to memory and concentration. And then the psychological symptoms, which we often hear from people when they've been able to look back over their menopause experience. They say, oh, actually, I did feel like that and I didn't understand why. And now I know that that can be a symptom. Well, I wish I'd have known before, because that would have really helped me. So things like anxiety, low mood, mood fluctuation, perhaps changes to levels of confidence. And that can be changes to levels of confidence in driving, in traveling on public transport. So when you look at a list of symptoms, it might not be obvious to you why those symptoms could have any effect on somebody in the workplace. But when you think of it more widely and about the effects of those symptoms on perhaps somebody's emotional well-being, on their physical abilities, or just on their stress levels, it's really clear that there can certainly be effects from those. And again, it's very individual.
Thank you. I think that's really useful. Oh, I've got an echo. Yeah, because even just on the ability to concentrate with some of those symptoms that you've just listed, you can understand immediately how that would affect people. So I'm going to turn to our guest panelists now. Karen, I'm going to come to you first, and I wonder if you could share with us how you got involved with menopause support initiatives at Denton's, and how you got involved, what Denton's were doing originally, and kind of what you've done.
Sure thing. So I think it's fair to say that up to about 2022, Denton's were dipping their toe in the water. The initiatives that we had here were spearheaded by our D&I group, but they had a very wide remit. Work had commenced on our menopause and hormonal change policy, so that was underway. But sort of towards the end of autumn 2022, our most senior female partner in the business was very keen to mark World Menopause Day. And that really took off. We booked a speaker and we held an event virtually. Following that, a group of like-minded individuals came together, and our steering group was created in January 2023, which is 2 years ago. And it was about that time that we were approached by you, Liz and Diane, to come and run a Menopause Reality session. And that, I suppose, is where the dial changed, really. Even as we were in that training, we were receiving invitations to come along to team meetings around Denton's and town halls. And that we embarked upon a sort of awareness raising campaign on the back of that. And that was really, as I say, where we turned the dial and where it all started, would be about March 2023.
And you mentioned a menopause steering committee. I guess that's quite interesting to just ask about that. What was the thinking? Did that bring together people from different parts of the business to bring sort of different experiences? Because that sounds like something that people might be quite interested in setting up themselves.
Yeah, I think there needed to be, I suppose, a driving force, didn't there?
Yeah.
And so we are a group of 6. And as you say, we're a professional services firm. So we have some solicitors, we have some business services individuals, we have people of all ages, and we've all come together to really drive the agenda. Really, that's what we did.
Right, that sounds fantastic. Thank you. And I'll come to you now, Charlotte, if that's okay. You're from Amy is quite a different sort of organisation, so it'd be really interesting to understand where things started for you and how you got involved.
Yeah, I think the starting point for us was quite different in that we had a senior female leadership, someone in the leadership team was female, had her own personal experience with menopause, and as a very male-dominated tech industry, we hadn't experienced that previously, and it wasn't really, I'll be honest, on our radar. So having someone going through that experience, it made me realize that we were missing something there. We needed to start thinking about both menstruation and menopause. So I sort of drafted a policy around it, and I worked with some sort of within my network people in the people field to make sure it covered everything, and I shared it with some people internally that I knew were personally impacted to make sure it really was fit for purpose. And a big part of that policy was around creating education opportunities. So people in management positions were given training as to what is the menopause, what does it mean, what can it mean on an individual basis, and what should we be doing as an employer to make sure that people have what they need when they need it. And then we also did a company-wide educational piece as well, with getting in an external speaker. And essentially, as a much smaller organisation, we put the ownership on everybody. We all had an opportunity to learn and grow our knowledge in this space so that we could all be an ally and a support network to those who were personally impacted and also indirectly impacted by the menopause. And it's just kind of grown from there.
That sounds great. Diane, I know from the sessions that we've run that this sounds like a familiar story where an initiative and a focus on providing support can come from one person's experience or one person taking the lead. Is that a common experience?
I think it's become increasingly more common in the last decade, particularly in the last 5 years. And I think much of that has been driven by the advocacy work that's been done by so many people around menopause in the last decade. So sort of making menopause something that we can talk about. Helping to normalize the conversation. I think that's really encouraged people within their own workplaces where they have had a negative experience to raise their own voices and say, well, I don't want that to happen to other people. And I think that's very much where the idea of sort of menopause advocates, menopause support groups, and actually organisations being driven by members of their team to actually take this seriously, because those individuals have been willing to share their own experiences, and then those businesses and those managers can learn from those experiences. I think it's really valuable.
So if people are here today and they're thinking, well, actually, yeah, we need to get started. We need to do something here. what would be, Diane, your kind of suggested starting points if you're starting from a base of nothing?
So I think it very much depends on the sort of whether or not there are funds available in terms of education and information. So for some organisations, they will invest in training for everybody. Some organisations will mandate training, others will invite. But as I said, I think it's really important that everybody has that understanding. I think one of the things that's really key is that this is not seen as a tick box exercise, that this is something that is ongoing. So menopause awareness and education and support is embedded within the culture of the organisation, rather than it just being, okay, well, we're going to write a policy, but then nobody's ever going to look at it and nobody knows what their part is within that policy, what they need to do to make that work. So I think, but also, sort of we've now, by the end of this project, we're going to have 5 of these recordings. So if you don't have a budget, there are lots of free resources like this out there now. I think good places to start in terms of good factual evidence-based information are things like the British Standards Institute policy. So it's a menstrual health and menopause guidance document. It's a really thorough document. There's useful information from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, from the Faculty of Occupational Medicine, from ACAS. So there's lots of good information out there. So particularly if you are, if you're the owner manager, or if you're a very small team and there isn't a budget for this. And then I think it's about talking to your team and asking what they would find helpful, because very often things are designed either for individuals or for teams of people, but they've had no input into them. So how can you know if it's going to be helpful if you don't ask? So ask that open question, what would help? And very often it is things like setting up a menopause support group in the organisation. And I've certainly had a hand in setting up those support groups within organisations where you've literally had a handful of people come to the first one. And by the second or third one, you've got 30 or 40 people. And it's not just women who come to those.
And our panelists might have got some experience that they can share with us on this, but if you wanted to go about setting up a menopause support group, what if you're not a menopause expert or a trained mentor, as some people are? I mean, can you just start one?
You don't have to be either of those things, Liz. I mean, essentially, this is just a place for people to talk about their experiences, share their experiences. So within these groups, they're generally not led groups. They're generally, the organisation provides a space, they provide a time, there's tea, there's coffee, there's biscuits. If you're lucky, there's cake. And it's really an opportunity for people to gather round and talk. But I think for me, what's been so encouraging about seeing this initiative grow is that very often it's just women that come to these initially, but then everybody comes along. So you'll have, you might have male colleagues come along who say, I'm aware that this group is happening and I'd really like to learn more about how I can support a partner, etc. Because, we have to remember that whilst, yes, of course, we're talking about menopause in the workplace, we don't leave our personal lives at the door. Mm-hmm. We are whole beings and we bring our whole person to work, and what happens outside of the workplace also affects inside the workplace. I've worked with many men particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, who have said, actually, I'm really affected by this because my sleep is broken too, or I'm really wanting to help my partner, my wife, but I don't really know how to. So I think it's such a valuable thing to have, where people can talk openly. And of course it helps to normalize the conversation, and that makes anybody who's struggling feel that they can come forward and seek support.
Absolutely. So Karen, it would be really great if you could share some of the things that have worked well that you've implemented within Denton's through the Menopause Steering Group.
Sure. We bought some books,
Right.
and we shared them around our offices. We did, as I explained, awareness sessions. So we went into team meetings, big and small, some very small team meetings, some big town halls, and talked a bit about the menopause. We bought some long line black cardigans, which we could put in the loos as part of the Black Cardigan Initiative, so that if people flooded, they had a way to cover themselves up. We created a SharePoint page on our portal, where we put lots of menopause resources, including the menopause support pamphlet, Understanding Menopause Guide, which is excellent. We got interested in going further in our sector, so we set up a menopause network for law firms, and we have about 15 law firms who are members. And we tell stories, and we use our firm-wide newsletters and our news centre to get people to tell their story about their experiences with menopause. And we did spend a little bit of money on training mentors for office. We're a big law firm, so we have lots of offices. And we did recruit 2 men, which I'm absolutely delighted to say. And so we have fantastic. 2 male menopause as well. And another very easy win is all of our menopause mentors have embedded in their sign-offs, proud to be a menopause mentor. And those sign-offs go out externally and internally in our organisation. And we've had clients say to us, "Oh, tell us a bit more about this. This is really interesting what you're doing." So some small wins.
Small wins, but yeah, that sounds great, because it is just about the visibility there, isn't it? And starting the conversation, and completely free to do that. So that sounds great. Lots of ideas there that people can implement. Charlotte, how about anything that's worked particularly well at Amy?
I think the biggest thing we focused on post having external speakers coming in and doing what we call a lunch and learn, so company-wide lunch and learn session around menstruation and focus on menopause at the time, was just kept the conversation going. As a much smaller organisation, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't a tick box. We didn't just say, right, we've done that and move on to the next thing. We wanted to keep the conversation going. And myself and one of the apprentices at Amy, who at the time was an 18-year-old, he came with me and did the virtual reality experience. And he's also been then championing menopause and saying, I am a son to a mother. I one day hope to have a wife, and I might even have daughters. I work in a female-heavy team. I want to make sure I know what I'm talking about, or I can be an advocate for people and support my colleagues and my family. So between us, we've kind of been the internal champions, creating opportunities for conversation and keeping the conversation going. That's been really important for us. And on a personal level, I've been experiencing perimenopausal for a few years now, and I've been able to share my own experience, which has led to a bit of an informal kind of support group. Listening to this, I'm realising it is a support group, but it was a network internally of people that I could go to and ask for advice and support, and vice versa. And we actually have started to see some of the men in our company come to us and say, "Oh, my partner's just started going through the menopause. Tell me, what do I need to know? And give me some advice, and how can I help?" And it's just been quite an organic, natural growth for us in that respect.
And so, all of these things sound great, and so many of them are completely free, which is, going to be music to people's ears, because, everything costs something, doesn't it, these days? So it's really great to know that there's lots of things that organizations can do without having to go and make a business case for it. But I think what would also be helpful, so that people are not disheartened if they hit any, is to understand the barriers that you might have faced in trying to roll out some of these initiatives. And then we can try and look at how you overcame them, because that might help people. Diane, shall I start with you? Are there common barriers that you hear of in workplaces to getting initiatives underway?
I think probably the most common barrier is the lack of awareness in terms of how this can affect people. So I think perhaps, sort of those outdated ideas that menopause is hot flushes and eventually no more periods, and that it happens to women in their 50s. I think, there is still quite a lot of that. I think the fact that, I think partly, sometimes it depends on the sort of the size of the organisation. Sometimes it depends on the makeup of the organisation. Sometimes it depends on that lack of education and lack of information. I think, thankfully, certainly within the last 10 years, we have seen a significant move from many employers to recognise that not only is this something that they should know about, but also actually in legal terms, they have a responsibility to know about. And I think, one of the ways that I have certainly changed some hearts and minds in the past is, I would always like to talk about things in terms of supporting people because it's the right thing to do. But actually, when you do hit any kind of pushback, I will often speak then to those people about what this is potentially doing to their bottom line. Because if you can't reach somebody in a heart-focused way, which is how I would like it to be, if you talk to them about having to replace a valuable member of the team and what it's going to cost them, but also what they're going to lose in terms of experience. I mean, yes, you can potentially replace that individual, but can you replace that experience? And it's also about the makeup of your team, particularly if you're a small team. That team that team works together, and if it works in a very fluid way, that is only going to be a positive for your business. If you take one part of that, if that machinery away, it's not to say that everything grinds to a halt, but it could be more clunky, it could be slower. So actually, by you just taking a step back and recognizing that maybe putting a little bit in, you are going to get an awful lot out, and you're going to keep really valuable people in your team. That has definitely been a strategy that's helped me reach people who didn't think that this was appropriate or something that they needed to look at.
Thank you, Diane. There's some great suggestions there for how to overcome some of those typical barriers that people might face. Karen, I wonder, did you hit any barriers, or did you just have an open door, basically, to rolling out support initiatives?
I've actually written here in my notes, actually, that yeah, we were pretty lucky. I mean, I think Davina had made a massive splash on Channel 4, and then we sort of came out riding on the back of that. We really haven't had a lot of pushback. I've learned some lessons. There's things I would do differently, maybe, to improve implementation. In our region, we have the Middle East as well, and so when talking to the Middle East, we've appreciated the cultural sensitivity around the menopause, and we've been supported by our local HR team to make sure that we get it right there. So, and we're a global law firm, so we have had some pushback from colleagues in the States. In the States, there seems to be quite a different attitude to talking about the menopause. And people have sort of, I feel some people don't really want us to particularly talking about cognitive issues and it going to competency. So there's been an awareness and a learning going on there as well. So it's, personally, I have a day job at Denton's. And I could,
how dare you?
I could spend hours doing the menopause stuff. So I have to deliver my day job as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a tension. If to be fair, to be honest, there is a tension in that. I'm organising events, we're uploading resources, we're trying to keep things evidence-based and up to date, sourcing long line cardigans from various supermarkets. We're doing all that, and we're doing our day jobs as well. But one of the things that I think has worked very well, and if you have an opportunity to do this in your organisations, is collaborating with other networks that you may have in your organisation, because I think that does really drives up levels of engagement. We collaborated with the Black Professional Network and looked at menopause through the lens of ethnicity. And I'm very hopeful that we'll be shortly collaborating around neurodiversity and the menopause with our accessibility group as well. So I think to harness those other networks that you have and come together is a really powerful thing.
That sounds like a great suggestion. Thank you, Karen. Charlotte, how about barriers that you might have faced in a smaller organisation?
From a company perspective, very lucky that there were none. I was kind of given free rein to do what I thought was best. I think the barriers I found mostly were on an individual level. Those people that I knew were suffering, but they put the barriers on themselves. They didn't want to have the conversation with their manager for whatever reason, to sort of say, I need some time or I need some support. I might have a few appointments with my doctor coming up that I need some flexibility to work around. So the barriers that I found were much more on that personal, individual level. But because I had the policy in place, I was able to talk them through it and, to let them know it was their right to ask for some time and to take the time when they needed it. People trying out new medications, it's good to know that that's happening so that we can support you through that process. So the barriers were very much on that individual level, but as a smaller company, the great thing was that we were able to very much on an individual basis break those down, remove the barriers, and the stigma around having the conversation. It is a very personal thing, so I completely understood why people felt they wanted to keep it close to their chest. But actually, time and time again, I found that the weight was lifted off of them when they did have that conversation with their manager and they were given the time and support they needed. And it's really benefited, and we're seeing less of the barriers now as we've had more people going through that process.
That's great to hear. So we're going to move on to the Q&A in just a few minutes, but I thought before we do that, it would be really nice to hear just a couple of examples of some really positive changes that you've observed in organisations since implementing these support. We've heard broadly about staff retention and that kind of thing, but I wondered if there's anything, Diane, again, I'll start with you. If there's anything that particularly springs to mind of examples that you know of in organisations where they really saw a benefit from putting this kind of support in place.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that instantly springs to mind for me is probably about 4 years ago now. So I've been doing training for businesses and organisations for a long time now. But it wasn't until about 4 years ago that I was asked by one organisation to provide a session specifically for men. And that was a real step forward. And essentially, the men in the organisation, some of them had joined a general session for everybody, but they felt that there were questions that they wanted to ask that they didn't want to ask in front of their female colleagues. because they didn't want to upset or offend anybody. So could they have a session for them? And actually, that's something that I've run quite a lot now. So running mixed sessions, but running sessions just for men. For me, I think the biggest moves forward have been the fact that we do have such good, freely available guidance, things like the BSI, etc. And I think just the amount now that it is spoken about. I mean, I don't know how many people on the call are on LinkedIn, but there would have been a time probably 5 or 6 years ago where you would never have seen menopause discussed on LinkedIn. Now it's everywhere. Along with lots of other things, which is all good, but things that were not necessarily thought to be something that was a subject for the workplace. And now it very much is. And that's very much a conversation that is joined in by everybody. So I think, we're definitely moving in the right direction. But we have a huge gap to fill. But the more that every individual is prepared to speak about it and help to normalise the conversation in their organisation, the better it will be, not just for them, but for all their colleagues too.
Fantastic, thank you. Karen, is there anything that hasn't been mentioned so far that has been a particularly obvious improvement to cultural benefit that you've seen from having this rolled out?
I think to echo what Diane said, so I'm currently sitting just over there as a coffee point, and in the coffee point is a big poster with the photos of all 11 of our menopause mentors across our offices. And you can walk around the floors now in our offices and you will hear the word menopause. And I don't think that would have happened. Last month, we trialed the Menovest, which some of you may have heard of, and our COO wore it in a board meeting. That just wouldn't have happened 4 years ago. So there is some fantastic stuff going on. For me, a really wonderful occasion was after a town hall when a 26-year-old associate got in contact to say that she had just gone into premature menopause and had felt so alone and no longer felt like that. And for me, that was just a winning result. We've had male managers tell us that they've now been able to signpost resources to members of staff, and we can see from our data, from the views that our resources get, that people are seeking support, and therefore must be getting what they need. What is not to like?
Fantastic, great to hear. Charlotte?
Really, just to echo what Karen and Diane have said around that conversation. And, I was in a kind of a board level meeting a few months ago, and one of the women in the room stumbling on words, and she went, "Oh, sorry, it's brain fog, menopause." And it was just a flyaway comment, but the room just acknowledged it and accepted it and offered support in that moment, said, "Oh, take your time." And I don't think that would have happened previously. I think, it would have been kept inside and it wouldn't have been just shared so openly. And yeah, just hearing people talking about menstruation and menopause openly in the office and just having that conversation without fear, I think that's been a really, really great shift.
Fantastic. That's really great to hear as well. I'm just starting to look through the questions. We've had lots of questions, so thank you very much. If anybody else would like to keep adding some, I will try and get round to them. I'm going to start with with a question. Hopefully, this is quite an easy one. Diane, one of our attendees has asked if there are any good resources to share for her husband, and I guess that's really useful for any men, whether it's for a husband or partner that they're seeking to support, but just anywhere that you would point them to look for support for their partners.
Well, I would say, workplace related or not, certainly the first one of this series of webinars There's also useful information on the Wellbeing of Women website. On the menopause support website, we have a document. So these are all free things. We have a document called Understanding Menopause for Partners. We also have a 44-page information booklet there called Understanding Menopause. And that's written for everybody. So I think, sort of those 4 things are a good start.
Fantastic. That's an easy one, right? I'm going to hit you all with a harder one here. So anybody can chip in with what you might do if this was what you were facing in your workplace. So one of our attendees has said that they have a policy manager that refuses to write a policy specifically to support menopause, as she doesn't want to do a policy for one group of people. Where do you go with that? I like Karen's face there. They clearly didn't have to deal with that.
So maybe that's one for Karen with her legal background, but there is a legal duty of care, and just remove the legal duty of care to employers to make sure that that is in place, and it regardless of it only being for one specific demographic. Every demographic is impacted by it, as we've talked about. So I would really push back, but I would do it evidence-based, and I would go in with the benefits, and I think Diane mentioned that earlier. It's not just about that individual need, but the benefits to the business and retention, and I think that evidence base would really help with that argument.
I would also say 2 things about that, Liz. One is it the policy manager's decision to make? Could that question be tabled higher up within the organisation? Now, if the policy manager is the owner of the business, that's a difficult situation. But if the policy manager isn't, I would be tabling that question higher up the organisation. And I would also say you don't have to have a policy. You can have a guidance document. Equally, it doesn't have to be called a policy. It can easily be a guidance document. And that individual could literally take something like the BSI guidance, and they could build something from that which would help them to understand. But I think the other thing that bothers me about that is that, the idea of not creating something for one group of people. Okay, I can I can see where that thinking might be leading, but also it seems to show a lack of understanding of why this is important. But yeah, I think first of all, I would be thinking about tabling it elsewhere. And secondly, I would be thinking, well, it doesn't have to be called a policy, it can be guidance. Equally, there are lots of big organisations who don't have a policy, but they do have menopause guidance, and it's really helpful for everybody in the organisation.
I think there is another question that asks more broadly about legal protections for people impacted by menopause in the workplace. Before we cover that at all, I will just point everyone to our last webinar. If you want more detailed information on this, we had an employment lawyer specifically, and we talked about this for a whole hour. So please do go back and do that. But I thought it might be useful to just set out, what are the legal protections broadly at the moment?
So essentially, it's 2 pieces of legislation: the 2010 Equality Act and the Health and Safety at Work Act. And under the Equality Act, there are protected characteristics which can be associated with menopause, absolutely. And the Health and Safety at Work Act, very broadly, essentially, it says, if somebody has disclosed something to you that is having an effect on them, you have to do everything within your power to ensure that what you're asking them to do within the workplace is not having a negative effect. So it's pretty simple. But again, many employers are they haven't put 2 and 2 together and recognised that those pieces of legislation can be associated with menopause symptoms too. And it's fair to say that there are increasing numbers of cases being brought by employees where they have not receive the right help and support. So it is within, it is in the interest of the business owner or the organisation to make sure that they know what their role within this is.
I remember a few months ago, I think it was, if I can imagine the passing of time now, there was quite a bit of news coverage that menopause wasn't selected as a protected characteristic. Do you think that has confused people slightly, so that they think that there doesn't need to be support?
Honestly, I wonder, for those of us outside of the world who sort of live, eat and breathe menopause, I'm not sure that was huge news to sort of the general population. I think there was a lot of disappointment for a lot of people. But ultimately, if you are going to employ people, you need to know what your legal duties are. And that means for anything that somebody might experience while they're working for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, regardless of whether it's a protected characteristic or not.
Because those protected characteristics that are currently in that act, they do apply to those who are going to be experiencing menopause.
We've got quite a few questions in the chat about medical support. And although we're talking mainly here about support in the workplace, as a line manager or as an employer, one of the things that seems to be quite common is employees struggling to access the medical support that they're trying to get outside of the organisation. Have you got any, if people are being dismissed or if symptoms are being misunderstood, if that's the feeling of the individual, what should individuals do to try and access the support that they're trying to get, and how can employers kind of guide them? What would be your guidance to individuals to get better support?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Okay, so if people are not getting the right help and support, which is generally that people are generally talking about their GP or their practice nurse.
Yeah.
So there are some things to consider when you are making an appointment. So the first one is that our GPs and practice nurses do not receive mandatory menopause training to date. Many of them have recognised that because they've never had that training, they would like to fill that gap themselves. So there are more and more who are doing some continued professional development to update their own knowledge. However, at the moment, it is very much a lottery as to who you might see. So I think the first thing that I would recommend to people is, if you are going to make that appointment to talk about perimenopause, early menopause, you might feel that you're in premature menopause, etc., whatever your experience might be, when you make that appointment, always ask, is there somebody in the practice who takes a special interest in menopause? And if there is, ask to see them. If there isn't, try and be as prepared for your appointment as you can with things like a completed symptom checker. If you're still having a monthly cycle, have a record of that, so that you can be you've done as much reading around this as you possibly can, so that you can be prepared, because these appointments are so short. When you go into that appointment, if you feel that you have not been heard, then I would recommend asking for that healthcare practitioner to perhaps speak with a colleague and see if they might be able to help you further. I think, unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen, particularly in recent years, is that because people have not been able to get the right help and support, they've felt that they had no choice but to pay privately, which nobody should have to do unless it is their first choice. There are some employers who do provide some assistance in terms of private help and support. So it's important to say that I think a lot of people who have private medical insurance think that their menopause experience is going to be insured as part of that, and unfortunately it's not. There are some bolt-on services and there are some other private services that some employers, it's not necessarily across the board. For some employees, they can get some help. A lot of employers have EAP, where you can, if you're sort of struggling emotionally, you can be put in touch with a counselling service. But ultimately, I hate to say it, but it is about keeping going and trying to find somebody within the practice. And if you can't, then it's worth asking that doctor to speak to a menopause specialist to see if they can provide advice rather than put you on a waiting list. And if you really can't find anybody, it's really worth making the practice manager aware, because that's a training issue at the practice. And it won't just help you, but it will help everybody that in a similar situation who comes after you.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to all of the questions here. I think we are pretty much covered. Yeah, so I think we're pretty much covered. Anything that we haven't managed to answer, we will follow up with. Zoe is going to share lots of links to resources, and she'll send that to everybody's registered email address, and we'll get that out to everybody as soon as possible after this webinar. So I'll hand back to Zoe now, and just to plug to the next webinar, we've got a webinar coming up, which I think is on Eventbrite now. I'll let Zoe talk about it so she can say whether it's live or not. But please do join us for that one, which is in March. And I'll pass over to Zoe to quickly, before I just do that, I'll just ask if there was any final comments that anybody wanted to share from the panelists. We really appreciate your time today and sharing your experience. Anything else that you wanted to share about your experience of providing support initiatives in your workplaces? No, great. We have covered a lot today. We've covered a lot. I will pass to I'll pass to Zoe. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So first of all, thank you to both Karen and Charlotte for your input today. It's been amazing, and thank you to everyone that joined, and to Liz and Diane. So the next webinar will be March the 12th, and the theme of that webinar will be focus on people who work in roles that are non-office based. So quite a broad spectrum, but it's a different area to, if you're having issues in menopause at work. So we're going to talk in detail about that. In terms of all of the stuff we've discussed today, I'll send out an email with all of the links. There is a question that we haven't covered, but I am going to cover that via an individual email, and I'll also cover it in the general email that I send out. I don't want anyone to think that we've ignored that question. It's just quite a big question. And then if anyone's got any other questions that they haven't had an opportunity, or they think of anything, then please do send me an email. You've got my email on the joining instructions, and I will reply directly.
Yeah, sorry, just to say on the questions, I've basically tried to select the questions that were specifically relevant to this webinar, but we will have an extended Q&A in the next webinar. So anything that we haven't covered, any questions that weren't on there, we can come back to when we've got more time in the next webinar, and Zoe will follow up as well.
For today, yeah, thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.